Good evening. I'd like to talk to you tonight about taxation and the cause-effect relationship as it led to the American Revolution. So tonight's video is installment 2 of the idea of cause-effect relationships between British colonial interactions in the build-up to the American Revolution. So what you're going to do in your notes is you're going to create a chart that looks like this chart that's on the screen right now. In the first column, you're going to put the name of the Parliamentary Act. In the second column, the date. The third column, what it said. And the fourth column, the colonial reaction to what it said. Now, the date is important simply so you see the chronology of events. I'm not going to ask you the date for anything that they did except the Proclamation of 1763. And since the date's in the name, I think you can figure out when the Proclamation of 1763 happened. So you're going to create a series of, I think there's 8 things that are in here. You're going to put them into this little chart and just kind of work through. So you can type this up or you can write this down, but you will be accountable for this. You need to know how these things all played together. Okay, so our first item here is going to be the Parliamentary Act, the year, what it said, and colonial reaction. So this is going to start off with the Proclamation of 1763. And like I saw in the first video of the night, was the idea that after Pontiac's Rebellion, the British were tired of dealing with all of these problems that the colonists had. So they decided to issue the Proclamation of 1763. In the Proclamation of 1763, they decided that colonists would no longer be allowed west of the Appalachians except fur traders. Now, fur traders, you see, are going to pay a tax to the British government, so the British government would allow them to go. Obviously, the colonists were not happy about this, and they decided that this was something that was extremely unfair. Now, there wasn't a lot that they could do at this point. We're still 13 years before the American Revolution. There's not enough anger and enough angst at this point for people to be truly upset with what's going on with the British. But there's certainly going to be this conflict of the British and the colonists beating heads against each other and trying to figure out who really should be in charge. So the Proclamation of 1763 kind of declares that. All right, then we jump ahead 1 year. Well, the British had run into a problem. In 1753, now we're going back a ways, in 1753, the British debt was somewhere around $75 million. Then the French and Indian War broke out. By the time the French and Indian War was over 9 years later, the British debt was over $150 million. So for a lot of people in Great Britain, they believed that this was clearly a problem with the colonies, that the colonies were getting too expensive. So the colonists, they felt, should start footing the bill for some of the expenses, some of the costs that there were associated with running a colony. So the British decided to pass what we call the Sugar Act. And in 1764, they passed a law that was the first step in reducing the idea of salutary neglect. So this tax was very simple. It actually reduced taxes from, I think it was 5 cents to 3 cents on all imports from the Spice Islands. Now, the Spice Islands are down in the Caribbean. This is in Cuba or St. Thomas or St. John's or whatever island you may be on, where the British imported sugar, tea, coffee, etc. But the key here is it reduced taxes, but they stated that they would start increasing enforcement. That enforcement would increase here quite a bit. So for the British colonists, who for years had practiced salutary neglect, had lived with salutary neglect, had enjoyed salutary neglect. Now the British are going to start enforcing their policies more. And so for the Americans, I don't know if you can call them Americans yet, for the colonists, this was a very frustrating process. So obviously they weren't happy, they complained, they were angry, but their biggest complaint boiled around the expression taxation without representation. This starts to become the buzzword because colonists started to say, now wait a minute, it's not fair that we're going to have to pay this tax and have no say in the passage of the tax. Even if the colonists had one representative in Parliament, they at least felt like they would have had someone in Parliament to say, now wait a minute, All British citizens should pay this tax. Because understand, this tax was not required of people who lived in England. This tax was not required of people who lived in South Africa. This tax was not required of people who lived in Latin America. This was simply for American colonists. Now, from the British perspective, they're simply trying to pay the bills. From colonial perspective, they felt like they were footing an unfair amount of the bill. So the colonists start to complain about taxation without representation. The British, they just kind of ignore them. So then, 1 year later, the British passed what we call the Stamp Act. Now, the Stamp Act seemed like a very benign little tax. It wasn't going to be that big a deal. It's just simply going to be a tax on all paper products. Newspapers, wedding licenses, deeds to property, anything that was printed on paper would pay a tiny, 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 tiny little tax. We're talking 1/10 of a cent of tax on any one piece of paper. So a newspaper, the price of a newspaper would go from 10 cents to 11 cents. It's not like it's a huge jump. But for the colonists, again, came this idea that the British stated that they are going to now enforce these laws a little bit more closely. And the colonists really did not like that, because this principle of salutary neglect that had been practiced by the British for so long, the colonists were not happy at all. So they start to protest, and we start to see the first kind of unified American protest against the British taxes. In Boston, they attacked the stamp master's house and burned his house down, and attacked the home that he lived in. There were protests in Virginia. There were boycotts of British goods in Pennsylvania. Now understand, most of these protests are happening in New England, where most of the people live. New York, Boston, Philadelphia. Though Philadelphia is not in New England. There's not a lot of protests down south, because the people in the South tend to not worry about it too much because they're so rich they don't care. But in the northern parts of the Americas, they really start to see this, and they really, excuse me, start to identify where these problems are going to happen, and they start to complain. Now, there's also an ulterior motive here for the British, because the way that you proved that you paid the stamp tax is that your paper was actually stamped by the tax collector. So if somebody wanted to publish a newspaper article that was critical of the British government, and they took it to the stamp collector and they said, hey, we need the stamp on here, here's your 9 cents, he would say, no, I'm not going to stamp that, because you're writing an article that is critical of the British government. And so it was another way that the British could then censor the media, censor the press, and this really concerned a lot of people in the Americas. And thus we started to see these protests grow and these boycotts begin. Now understand, these boycotts of British goods, as we talked about on Thursday last week in our simulation, the only way you're going to get manufactured goods in the Americas is to buy them from the British. So this boycott hurt the colonists too, but they were really trying to hurt the pocketbook of the British in London, because what the colonists realize is we cannot have a say in Parliament, but what we can do is get people in Great Britain to have a say for us, because we're going to hurt them economically, because the British government was making millions of dollars a year off of these colonists, the equivalent of millions of dollars a year off of these colonists. So then another year passed, excuse me, not another year, later that summer, the colonists were even further outraged by what the British passed as the Quartering Act. This was the Quartering Act of 1765. Colonists and colonial assemblies, the British government said, must pay for British soldiers to live there. It went on further to say that at any time the colonists could lose their home, because a British soldier, a British government official, could come in and say, I like this house. I'm going to use this as my base of operations. Oh, I like this house. I'm going to use this. And they would have absolutely no recourse whatsoever. The British government was going to get the colonists to pay for this. So if the British had to send the army over, and they sent over 200 men, they would farm those men out to just random houses. And they'd say, Bob, you get these 3 guys. Steve, you get these 2 guys. And Steve would say, where am I going to sleep? And the government would say, I don't care, but the army, the soldiers get your house first. and they get your food, and they get your fireplace. So obviously the colonists were very upset about this. Many of the colonial legislatures, colonial assemblies refused to pay to house British soldiers to come to the colonies to enforce laws that the colonists didn't like in the first place. Now, again, you have to look at it from both sides, the British perspective and the colonial perspective. From the British perspective, they're simply saying, hey, we wouldn't have these problems if you guys would just obey the laws as they are written. And the colonists are saying, yeah, but they're stupid laws and we don't have any say in the laws. So there really is a lot of give and take, but there's this cause and effect relationship. The Stamp Act and the Quartering Act in 1765 really start to poke the fires, if you will, for the colonists, because the colonists really start to get interested in politics now. Before, they really didn't get that interested in politics, but now there's a lot of reason to get interested in politics because the British are being kind of prickish about this. They're really starting to stick their nose into colonial business, and a lot of colonists don't like that. So, then in 1766, after much hand-wringing and finagling and politics and whatnot, in 1766, the British decide to repeal the Stamp Act. To repeal a Stamp Act simply means it's no longer valid. So they repeal the Stamp Act. Colonists are like, awesome, we're happy. That's cool. Whatever. We don't care what you say. But part two of the Declaratory Act, because there were two parts to the Declaratory Act, Part one said, we're going to repeal the Stamp Act because it's kind of an annoying thing. But part two said, but don't forget, colonists, we're in charge. We're in charge of the colonists. And they stuck their finger right in their face, just like that. And so the colonists are like, whatever, you can be in charge all you want. We won. We had these protests, we had these boycotts, and we won what was happening in the Americas. And so they really started to get excited about all of this stuff. They really started to get interested in all this stuff. And they're like, okay, this is cool. But then the British got a new finance minister, a guy by the name of James Townsend, or was it Robert Townsend? No, Robert Townsend was a musician from the 80s. I think it was James Townsend. Charles Townsend, one of those names, something Britishy. So the Townsend Acts are passed in 1767, 1 year later. This time we're not going to just tax paper goods. We're going to tax everything, just a tiny, tiny little bit. We're going to put a tiny little tax on paper, tiny little tax on paint, wood, glass, lead. We're going to tax everything, but we're going to just tiny little tax it. Well, they figured at the most colonists are going to be upset about these taxes, but hey, they can deal with the taxes. What they didn't understand is that the colonists really would get upset by these taxes. Colonists in Boston started to protest, which of course led to the Boston Massacre, which was this massive protest of like 20 guys who went and protested, and the Boston Massacre happened, in which 5 people got shot, 3 of them died. Or no, 8 people got shot, 5 of them died. Not that big of a massacre, but still, it was a massacre. So the colonists were upset by this. Things got really ugly in Boston, and we started to see more boycotts of British goods. We're going to try to punish the British economically and make that work. But really the biggest thing that started here as a result of the Townsend Acts was this idea of a circular letter. And a circular letter is a very simple idea. I'm going to take a letter in Massachusetts, and I'm going to write a note. Dear Virginia, this is what's happening in Massachusetts. Isn't that annoying? And then they would send it to Virginia. Virginia would say, Dear Connecticut, here's what's happening in Virginia. And they would send it to Connecticut. And Connecticut would read Massachusetts' letter, and they would read Virginia's letter, and then they would add to it. And then they would send that letter on to North Carolina. And then they would send that letter on to South Carolina. And it would make its way all the way back to Massachusetts. And they would take out their old letter, and then they would put in a new one. Here's what's happened since we wrote our last letter. This was like this big circular, group chat. Only they didn't obviously have the internet, so this was a group chat, and this was an opportunity for all the colonies to share information. And again, we start to see this evolution, this development of an American identity. We're in this together, guys. It stinks here in Massachusetts. It stinks in Virginia. It stinks in Connecticut, and here's why. And so this really starts to become a consistent pattern. I'm going to have to stop there because I'm running out of time. I'll finish the rest of this in segment 3 of our presentation. Have a nice day.